Let's just listen into what UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres had to say about the situation unfolding.
President Putin, in the name of humanity, bring your troops back to Russia. In the name of humanity, do not allow to start in Europe what could be the worst war since the beginning of the century.
President Putin has announced military operations in Ukraine. As per President Putin, military operations in Ukraine have been ordered, and Putin says that Russia's attempts to agree on NATO non-expansion were in vain. This happened as the United Nations Security Council meet was underway. You heard the comments by Antonio Guterres there. Russia has been urged to return to the diplomatic table and continue the diplomatic path forward. However, Putin says that Russia cannot feel safe, develop, exist with a constant threat from Ukraine. And international affairs expert Stephen Golub is now joining us live from Moscow. Thank you so much for joining us right now. Can you just get us up to speed with what the situation is currently on ground?
It's just, well, I'm sorry, I'm not in Moscow. I'm in California. But you know, as I understand it, the invasion that we've all unfortunately been anticipating has now started, and it's going to be massive and you know, and very unfortunate for Ukraine to start with, but for the rest of the world, even including Russia.
Right, absolutely. Also, the West and the United States have been reiterating a united front in this situation. They have often reiterated their support for Ukraine. But how do you see the support materializing now that the situation is in a very unprecedented situation that we're witnessing right now?
Well, unprecedented is an excellent word. This is something we haven't seen for decades, at least in Europe and in much of the world. You know, one country simply deciding to take over another militarily. Ironically, in some ways, there's a real downside for this for Mr. Putin in that if he wanted to divide NATO and to undermine American leadership of NATO and its members and other democracy-favoring and democracy-loving states, he's accomplished exactly the opposite. NATO is unified. President Biden, who I will criticize in some ways on some issues, I think has shown very good leadership, and the U.S. has shown leadership of this coalition now, both a de facto coalition of countries opposing the invasion and the actual coalition that constitutes NATO.
Right, absolutely. Also, talking about the situation on ground currently, there have been reports of explosions in Kyiv and Kharkiv. Do you think the situation will not just be limited to eastern Ukraine? What do you think are the next steps on Russia's part here?
That's a very good question. I'm sorry I don't have a great answer. It might make sense to limit the invasion to part of the country simply because Ukraine is a large country with 44 million people. To control all of it, to simply take it over might be one thing. To maintain control against an insurgency or other efforts to undermine Russian control of the country might be a totally other thing. I don't want to make this analogy any more than in a very comprehensive way, but to hark back to when the U.S. went into Iraq, for better or worse. Taking over the country was relatively easy. Maintaining control was another matter. So that may be one argument for only maintaining control over part of Ukraine. But who knows what Vladimir Putin is thinking? And what he's thinking, even though we've long thought of him as a cold, calculating, rational individual, some of his words and actions recently indicate that he might not be quite that rational and quite that intelligent in the way he goes about things, which throws the whole question of how much of the country he'll take over up in the air.
Right, absolutely. Now, we've seen that weeks of diplomacy urging Russia to withdraw troops has done little to diffuse the tensions here. Putin also warned that other countries, any attempts to interfere with this Russian action would lead to consequences that they've never seen. How do you assess these statements?
Oh, I think we're going to see some strong economic sanctions against Russia, Russian institutions, and Russian oligarchs, among other steps that might be taken. And those may be relatively unprecedented. Exactly how they'll play out, we're going to find out in coming hours and days. Right. But they are going to hit Russia pretty hard. Will they be hard enough to make Russia withdraw? No. I think now that the decision has been made to go into Ukraine, Mr. Putin has, kind of cast the die, and we'll see what happens from there. I don't think he's going to be pulling out anytime soon, if at all.
Right. Also, just for more clarity on this, how do you see the role of the United States and Western allies in this situation? And going forward, what more do you think that the international community can do to help Ukraine?
Good question. I think perhaps both the U.S. and the Western allies and the international community can deny certain computer technology to Russia. It can shut off or at least cut down on use of Russia's natural resources, because Russia is kind of a petrostate. A lot of its resources, its budget, its economy depends on exporting oil and gas. So cutting that off could well hurt Russia. Now, and it may in turn hurt Germany and other parts of Europe, but those are the kind of steps that could be taken. If I just may add one point, right. This is the kind of what Putin has done here also has ramifications way beyond Europe, in terms of setting a bad precedent for other parts of the world. China may use this precedent as one excuse to go into Taiwan, to take over Taiwan, which it's been eyeing for decades. I'm not saying this is going to happen to India, but Mr. Putin is saying, well, if a country hasn't existed as a cohesive whole for centuries, maybe it's not a real country. Well, India is a mighty, powerful, leading country in the world, but as a unified, independent nation, it doesn't go back that far. So he's undermining India's legitimacy. And so this is setting bad precedents in all sorts of ways that not just for Europe, but for the entire world.
Right. Mr. Stephen Golub, thank you. Just stay with us, stay on with us. Let's just first show you the visuals from Kyiv now, as the air raid sirens rang out in downtown Kyiv on Thursday. You can see the visuals on your screens. This is the moment where the air raid sirens rang out in downtown Kyiv. Once again, going back to Mr. Stephen Golub, thank you so much for staying on with us. Just for more clarity on this, the conflict in Ukraine threatens to displace some 5 million people. What can you tell us of the broader implications of this, and also Russia's efforts to now have a hold on the security framework here?
Well, it could end up displacing more than 5 million people, and many people we may be talking thousands or many thousands of people may die as a result of this invasion, not to mention if Russia's going to maintain control or put in some kind of a puppet government, that's going to involve the arrests, the trials, or simply detentions of people, imprisonment of people indefinitely, maybe for years and years. So there's all sorts of ripple effects simply within Ukraine. There may be, of course, a refugee flow into other parts of Europe, those who can get out. So in those respects, it's going to be a humanitarian disaster as well as a geostrategic challenge to much of the world, and be a very destabilizing influence on much of the world, including also, sadly, on the world economy, which again will not just affect a few nations, it could affect the entire world, including India.
Absolutely. Again, we've spoken about this, but Western condemnation hasn't done much to deter Russia. Now, what do you think are the next steps for Ukraine?
Oh, well, as we said, we're discussing, economic sanctions against Russia, and some of Mr. Putin's closest cronies could wreak some harm in terms of the Russian economy. Cutting off or at least limiting supplies of technology that Russia can't come up with on its own, and that can't even get from an ally such as China. Cutting off its economy in other ways, access to credit, access to investment by foreign energy companies, which can be very important. Cutting back on its sales. One other ramification, I think, is this could really, I'm speculating now. It's not the most immediate one, but the dependence on oil and natural gas that the world still has to a good extent is not just bad for the environment in India, the US, and everywhere, but it's a geostrategically bad thing that a country like Russia should control a chunk of the world's natural resources and use that to try to hold Europe hostage, as well as to in effect financially support a repressive dictator, and now fuel his invasion of a peaceful neighboring democratic country. So maybe, just maybe, one of the indirect ramifications might be nudging some countries towards a greater awareness of moving away from petroleum and related products, related sources of energy, towards alternative energy sources. Maybe that could be one good thing that could come out of this, along with the many, many bad things.
Right, Mr. Gorb, I keep circling back to the same thing. How do you assess President Joe Biden's response and role in this situation?
I think he's done pretty well, actually. It's not an easy job to deal with an unprecedented invasion of another country, across the ocean. But I think he had one big initial mistake when he said something like, a minor incursion, might be handled differently than if there's a major invasion by Russia. But he quickly walked that back the same day, he and his advisors. And since then, he's done, I think, a good job of unifying, helping to unify the West, calling for support from other countries, including, major players such as India, releasing intelligence indicating what Russia was planning on doing, such as invading Ukraine on some kind of a pretext and other plans it was making, so that Putin couldn't claim, oh, we were attacked first, or couldn't legitimately claim in any way that we, meaning Russia, was attacked first. I think he's been pretty solid so far, dealing with a very, very difficult situation. And this is a situation in which his years, or really decades, involved with foreign affairs in the Senate, and then as Vice President of the United States, come in very, very usefully for him, and that he's attained some wisdom in dealing with this horrible situation as a result of that experience.
Right. Mr. Stephen Gorb, thank you so much for joining us with all your insights on this situation. Moving on now, international affairs expert Kadia Petagora joined us earlier. Let's just listen in to his analysis of the situation.
Any kind of economic sanctions or deterrence in that way was not going to work, because the issue here for Russia and for President Putin in particular was about it was twofold. It was strategic, and it was about national pride. And in terms of strategic, they would never allow for Ukraine to be used as a base for potential NATO missiles that could reach Moscow in a very short period of time. That would significantly weaken their defense capability. And in terms of national pride, you've seen it in his speeches, the one the other day and today, where he evokes a lot of historical and nationalistic ideas and really talks about the whole history of the region. And of course, also in terms of what he sees as the Russia's humiliation after the collapse of the Soviet Union and what he calls the broken promise of NATO not expanding to the east. So I think this was a military and strategic issue, and I think Russia is willing to take the hit economically for it. It's all about a continuum. So I think, like he mentioned, red lines. So you've got missiles in a certain part, but the number of missiles that can reach Moscow and the distance of all of them, all these things are calculated when it comes to their sort of defense strategies. So I think, he drew a point here, and I think because of those sort of historical and cultural connections with Ukraine, he was going to draw Ukraine as the red line. And also, I think a lot of those other missiles in Eastern Europe were there before his time and before Russia was powerful enough to sort of retaliate. So I think Putin really sees this as a kind of a legacy move before he ends his time.